Good day. My name is Joanne Joseph, and I am Professor of Community and Behavioral Health and Psychology here at SUNY Poly. And today we are recording the second training video having to do with adverse childhood experiences. So what I would like to do to start with is to introduce our just fabulous panel today, who are going to share their information about what ACEs looks like across the lifespan, because there are different features that adverse childhood experiences exhibit over the lifespan. And so that's our purpose today, is to concentrate on what those characteristics might look like. So without any further ado, might I ask my friend here to introduce herself, and we'll go on.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Joseph. My name is Michelle Kelly. I'm with Mohawk Valley Community Action Agency, and I'm the Assistant Director with the Head Start Early Head Start program.
My name is Heidi Allen. I am an elementary principal in the Camden Central School District at McConnellsville Elementary School.
Hi, my name is Ann Lansing. I'm the CEO of Safe Schools Mohawk Valley.
Hello, I'm Pat Roach. I am a psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner and clinical assistant professor at SUNY Poly.
So just by way of a brief summary to summarize what we did on the first video, if you recall, ACEs, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, consists of some very negative experiences that an individual might have during the first 18 years of their life. Those experiences generally include emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, but they can also include some very negative environmental conditions like food insecurity and poverty and discrimination. All of these factors impact the developing brain in many different ways. And so today, our focus is on what those changes look like, what the effects of these adverse childhood experiences have over the lifespan. And we're going to start with young children, when we're talking about preschool children here, and what we're likely to see. So, Michelle, if you wouldn't mind sharing your experiences.
Sure. So with preschool children, specifically the 3 and 4-year-olds, what we see is that the children really have a hard time staying focused. They have a very difficult time following simple directions. We also see children that are having a hard time building peer relationships, as well as relationships with adults within the classroom. Some of these children are also facing attendance issues. So when they're not attending school regularly, that has a whole host of other challenges. They're falling behind with their academic learning, difficulty with the daily schedule, and really just not feeling part of the classroom community because they're not there to build the relationships. What we're seeing more recently and definitely on the rise are some of the children that are exhibiting very extreme violent behaviors.
Yes.
And these behaviors not only are self-harm, for example, head banging is something that we're seeing a rise in. We're also seeing children that are exhibiting behaviors that are destructive to the physical environment. So at 3 and 4 years old, throwing of chairs or tipping tables, throwing materials throughout the classroom, which again, when those behaviors, do occur, it's scary for the other children, and then again lends itself into these kiddos really not developing, friendships because the other children don't want to play with them. And for these, particular children, they really struggle to be able to calm down after one of these episodes.
Yes.
They're lasting a lot longer than what we used to see.
Yes. very, very interesting because that's true, and I think we're going to hear that echoed throughout our discussion today. And the question is, why? And we do know that these adverse effects do affect the parts of the brain that allow children to control their emotions. So if that's dysregulated, obviously we're going to see this, but they're also seeing more violent things in terms of social media and maybe within the home situation. So it's not just one thing or the other. It's sort of a combination of things, and it is creating quite the management issue. So that's something that we're looking forward to talking about in the next 3 and 4 videos, in video number 3 and number 4, I should say. So Heidi, are you seeing some of the same patterns?
So we are seeing a lot of the same patterns at the school age level. So we are a pre-K 4 building, and we have definitely seen an increase in students exhibiting more violent and dangerous behavior in the school. Again, throwing of objects, oftentimes not necessarily at other children, but disruptive and destruction of the entire classroom or of materials hanging in the hallways. We also see children who are withdrawn, don't want to be with other children, oftentimes are able to easier relate to adults than other children. Definitely the difficulty with building relationships, whether it be with adults or with other children, because of trust concerns, not having an adult in their life when they enter into school that they can trust. Very dysregulated with their own emotions, being unable to control their emotions, unable to maintain attention to the instruction, which lends itself to them falling behind educationally with the curriculum in the classrooms. We also sometimes see the kids just checking out, not even engaging in the instruction or being able to complete work, complete assessments in the classroom, and that lends itself to them being ostracized by other children, not being able to participate in activities. We know that oftentimes children in the homes, if there's not a core family nucleus, are on video games or playing on gaming systems. So those children are likely receiving a lot of instant gratification from participating in those activities. So it's difficult for them to sit and attend for a long period of time when there's not consistent, stimulation for these children, or they have to wait, to have a question answered or to work with a teacher. So then they're acting out, trying to gain attention, oftentimes in very negative ways. Some of the things that they're exposed to at home, they're emulating at school. Yelling out vulgarities, being, aggressive with other students, pushing students down, their temper increasing really quickly. And this lends itself to them also yelling at adults, screaming at teachers, at administrators, and again, other children in the classroom, which then again ostracizes them even more and, roadblocks them being able to form relationships.
So we're seeing this cascading set of effects. Interesting, Heidi, that you should bring up the fact that you're seeing more of difficulties in delay of gratification. That's critical for future success and productivity. We know that kids that can't delay gratification early in the cycle do more poorly on SATs, do more poorly academically, and have work performance issues. So these are certainly concerns. And again, to our audience, please don't get too pessimistic just yet, because there are things we can do about this. And we will be addressing what we can do in future videos here, but we really wanted to give you a good idea of what the clinical picture looks like. So, what about our adolescent population, Annie? What do they look like?
I don't know that it's any different from what's already been said. The scary thing to me is that we see the behaviors younger, but we don't always address them or know what to do with them. So it just progressively gets worse. As they get older, it doesn't get better. But I think we're seeing a lot more risk-taking of kids. And it's just, You know, I've been with my position 18 years, and it's gotten worse and worse and worse. And so we've got to do some more, as you mentioned, some more responses to all of it. But I think what we're seeing a lot more, suicides completed in ideation. We're seeing a lot more kids taking risky behaviors in their neighborhoods, whether they're using drugs, selling drugs, they've got weapons. And some of them are learning that this is a way they can get attention. As you mentioned, it's a way to get some self-satisfaction, to make friends. Because they haven't found a good way to do that, they'll try anything. And I think that's what's extremely scary, because they can get access to a lot of things that I think us from another generation can't even imagine how easy it is. So, but we're seeing a lot more of that anger and how they're using that anger in ways. And so a lot more sexual behavior, you know, teen pregnancy, dating violence, and I'm finding that kids just don't want to be a part of it even more. So other kids don't want to get involved, so they stay away and they get isolated. And now they don't have a good peer group. So they end up with another group that is reinforcing all that negative behavior. And that can be coming from home, and that can be just coming from the streets, right? So when you're a little bit older, you can get away with more, you've got less parental control. And I think a lot of parents also don't know how to control the kids' behavior. And so they might say, I'm going to take away your phone, but to a kid, it's like taking off a limb. So then that's hard to do, and then the kid can go crazy with that too. So I think it's really challenging for these students to know how to behave. And, you know, when they're trying to be in a classroom for 40 minutes and stay regulated, some of them, it's nearly impossible. And that's frustrating to the whole system. So what do we do about all of that? But I think there's a lot more out there that exposes them to be more violent too.
Yes, well, I couldn't agree with you more. And a lot of that has to do with social media.
Yes.
So if you don't have good models at home, and you're not finding them in other outlets like social media, then what do we expect here? So these are all important factors to consider when we talk about what can we do about this, because those are factors that we can control, and we may need to, and we may need to start thinking outside the box in terms of how to.
And I think what you had said in the last series, in part 1, is talking about how pervasive this is, that we have to look at it. It's not just an inner city problem. It crosses everything. So it could be that nice neighborhood that you live in, and you're not realizing what's happening inside the home or to that child. So that's, you know, to be aware. Like, I think we want to just say it's them, it's someone else, it's not my problem. And we're seeing it across the board in all school districts. Like, you might want to think, like, Camden, maybe that's a safe community, but it's not, because there's a lot happening where there are kids everywhere.
I couldn't agree with you more. You know, it's also interesting that you mentioned that there's an increase in suicidal ideation and suicide attempts. That's significant. Interestingly, the research on COVID showed that kids are much more anxious, much more depressed than they were prior to COVID. But that's connected somehow to the loneliness and to the isolation. So I guess what I'm hearing is the intersection of all of these kinds of variables. So I'm hearing these kids are more isolated. This isolation creates more negativity. That negativity drives them to look for release and relief in engaging in more risky behaviors, or behaviors that might get the attention of others. And we know from an evolutionary point of view that negative attention gets you attention much faster than positive attention. So this all is making sense. Unfortunately, it's not great, but at least we're beginning to understand what the dynamic is. And again, for those viewing this particular video, understanding the dynamic first is the first step in figuring out what we can do about it, which is one of the reasons why we're doing this. So now we're going to ask Pat to talk to us about how this looks in adulthood.
So from a clinical perspective, what we see in adults, I typically think in the biopsychosocial model. From a biological perspective, long before they're even in preschool, there's changes going on at a cellular level. So through the study of epigenetics, which is a relatively emerging field, last 10 years or so, we're learning more and more about it. Things that happen in childhood have an impact on adulthood. It's definitely a connection to the mind-body piece of it. And so what happens is core regulatory processes in the biological system get altered. And so later in life, and we're proving this now, there's increased incidence of cardiovascular disease, autoimmune disorders like fibromyalgia, gastrointestinal illnesses like irritable bowel syndrome. So we can see it from a biological perspective. These adults are less healthy, related to the developmental traumas that they endured, and it happens at a cellular level. From a psychological perspective, all the things that you've mentioned, dysregulation, problems with relationships, that continues into adulthood and often gets magnified because there's a work setting, there's a family setting. And then the problems that occur with depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, those have lingering effects on a lifetime from adulthood and beyond. And then from a social perspective, if you add all that together and look at how do these folks show up in the workplace?
Yeah.
They have more absenteeism, just like they did in school, related probably to their biological problems or their medical disorders. Also with their anxiety and depression or post-traumatic stress, so we see a higher incidence of absenteeism. Or worse than that, they may be unemployed or underemployed, not able to reach their full potential because of these things that are holding them back. So it's truly a whole systems approach in adulthood that we see that's troubling. It really is troubling. And again, it starts at a very young age from a genetic cellular level.
Yes, yes. Thanks, Pat, for that wonderful summary. I think you did a great job of putting this all in perspective. But we do have one more question here to address. And the question is, what happens to those kids who then become parents? What happens to the transgenerational effects? What are they and how do they look? And I'm wondering if any of you have had experience with that. Heidi, my guess is that you've had to deal with parents who have been traumatized and are trying to raise kids and trying to turn the cycle around. So would you be willing to kind of give us your insights on that?
Sure. So I see kind of an intersection between the adults that Pat's discussing and then our students. And oftentimes those children that become adults and have children of their own continue to remain kind of in that cycle of trauma. So whether it be that they're underemployed or they have food insecurities, they're experiencing their own significant medical conditions that render them unable to be gainfully employed, and then have children who are witnessing and then experiencing similar trauma, such as divorce or inability for that parent to form and maintain a meaningful relationship. Also, families that are experiencing addiction, whether it be alcohol use or substance abuse, women who continue to be victims of sexual mistreatment in the home that students are experiencing, and incarcerated parents. There's oftentimes a very negative connotation with law enforcement, so students are always fearful. And when things happen with our students and we have to involve Child Protective Services or other types of agencies, or we're bringing parents in to explain that their children are struggling academically, it just brings back all of those negative experiences that adult may have experienced in childhood. So it's very difficult for adults that have lived through and continue to live with significant trauma in raising children. It's very cyclical, and it has an even more significant impact on those students.
For sure. I mean, we see generations of trauma, intergenerational trauma that is replicated. In my practice, I've treated the grandparent, the parent, and the child. Yeah. So you can see where what you're saying is absolutely true.
Yeah. Yeah, yep. You know what a good question, though, is? What makes the difference? Because there are individuals who have experienced this trauma and don't continue the cycle. So why is that? You know, what makes the difference? And I know we're sort of previewing our next few videos, but I've always been struck by the fact that there are little things that we can do, and it usually has to do with that relationship issue. And you folks mentioned that over and over again, you know, the isolation from other children or other peers or other adults. And if we could break through that isolation and have a contact with a caring adult early in the cycle here before they reach you, honestly, that makes a huge, huge difference. So that speaks to some interesting both community programs, but also a different way of thinking about how we need to structure our own personal lives and structure society, and what maybe schools need to look like. Pat, you always mentioned to me the book that you just love to read.
What happened to you? So instead of saying what's wrong with you to a child or an adult who is exhibiting problems, it's really looking beyond that and saying, what happened to you?
Right.
And then circling back and saying, what can we do? There's actual evidence that you can show through a functional MRI or even heart math where just a kind, calming conversation with a child can alter their biological response to a
That's right.
situation.
That's right.
So,
That's right.
And I think it helps so much when you build a relationship with a child too, to always remember, if you promise them something, follow through.
Yes.
Because they've got enough people in their lives who aren't.
Right.
And you know, and the other thing in my agency, we've had to change the way we deliver services over the last 20 years to meet the high rates of all this that we're seeing, where I tell my staff all the time, when a kid walks in the door, just say, hi, I'm so glad you showed up today.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
you know, 20 years ago, if you had asked me if that would work, I'd say no way. That's not going to get a kid to come to school.
Yeah.
But it does.
Yes.
It truly does, because they
Yes.
are so striving, as you mentioned, for someone to acknowledge them, someone to show they care about them.
Yes.
And then they can start to break down some of their defenses. And that's what I've always loved about the brain. The brain has an amazing way to protect us in these horrible situations. But we have to let go of those as we get older. Right? We can't keep using those, which could be the pushback. I don't care what you say. I'm good on my own. I'm going to protect myself. But it's showing kids how to develop those relationships,
Yes.
which are so hard and so meaningful.
Yes. This reminds me of one of my cases many years ago, early in my career. I was working in an elementary school setting with a quote-unquote pilot program. This was a push-in program as opposed to shipping kids with difficulties out. This one brave teacher decided that she was going to try to deal with them within the context of a school system. So we had a special ed class. Now that's not so unusual, but it was back then. And we had this one young 10-year-old boy, cute as could be, probably saved him half the time, but he would get into these rages, and just what you described before, throwing desks, throwing things, and saying vile things. And he was doing really well, and then he had one of these episodes. And you know, I took him, got him quieted down, and then we had this tradition of doing circle time, where we asked the child to say something that they really were appreciative of that day, using gratitude as a intervention tool, which we'll talk more about in future videos. But I was struck because he got into the middle of the circle and he looked at me and he said, Dr. Joe, thank you for not giving up on me. And that speaks to just what you're describing here, because you could easily give up on him, but that was so important. And so I absolutely agree. And now we have the data to prove that that is important. And so those are some of the points we will be talking about in our future videos. So thank you again for listening to us, and stay tuned for video 3 and 4, where we'll be talking more about what it is we could do to address adverse childhood experiences.